My own father left me stranded at airport security when I was just 10 years old. He handed me two crumpled $100 bills and told me to find my own way home because his luxury vacation was only for his real family. He had no idea my estranged mother was about to land on a private jet to claim me. When he finally returned from Aspen, he found my bedroom completely empty and a legal notice resting on my bare mattress that made his new wife scream in absolute horror. My name is Cassidy, 33 years old, and this is how I learned that blood means nothing when money and status are on the line. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut toxic family members out of your life for good. The harsh, fluorescent lights of Chicago O'Hare International Airport buzzed above me. I was 10 years old, dragging a duffel bag that was entirely too heavy for my small frame. We were supposed to be going to Aspen for a winter holiday. Instead, my father Donovan stopped right before the security checkpoint and turned to face me. He reached into his tailored wool coat, pulled out two crumpled $100 bills, and shoved them into my hand. "Take an Uber back to the house," he said, his voice completely devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "This trip to Aspen is for my real family. I do not need you ruining the dynamic with your gloomy attitude." I stood frozen, clutching the cash. Beside him, my stepmother Sylvia adjusted her designer sunglasses and let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Oh, Donovan, do not be so harsh on the girl," Sylvia crooned, though her eyes glinted with pure malice. "It is not her fault she takes after her mother, destitute, depressing, and utterly useless. Go home, Cassidy. Eat some frozen dinners and try not to break anything. Madison needs a peaceful week in the mountains without her charity case of a stepsister bringing down the mood." Madison. My 8-year-old stepsister smirked at me from behind a massive cup of hot chocolate. She kicked my duffel bag with her pristine white snow boot. "Yeah, go home," Madison whined. "Daddy says you are just a tax write-off anyway." Donovan did not correct her. He did not reprimand his new wife or his spoiled stepdaughter. He simply turned his back on his own flesh and blood, grabbed Sylvia by the arm, and walked through the premium security lane. He did not look back once. Not when they handed their boarding passes to the agent, and not when they disappeared down the concourse toward their first-class gate. Most 10-year-old girls would have collapsed on the airport floor in tears. They would have panicked, begged, or sought out a security guard for help. I did not shed a single tear. I had spent the last 2 years living in Sylvia and Donovan's suburban mansion, enduring daily insults, wearing Madison discarded clothes, and listening to my father call my biological mother a worthless failure who abandoned us. I was done crying. I walked to a quiet seating area near a coffee shop, pulled out my cheap prepaid phone, and dialed a number I had memorized but was forbidden to call. My mother, Diana, picked up on the second ring. "Cassidy," her voice was sharp, alert, and instantly filled with concern. "Why are you calling me from a cell phone?" Donovan strictly banned us from speaking outside of court-mandated hours. "He left me at gate 24, I said, my voice steady and cold. "He gave me $200 and told me to take an Uber home because his real family needed a vacation without me." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then I heard the sound of a chair scraping violently against a floor. "Stay exactly where you are," Diana commanded, her tone dropping to a lethal whisper. "Do not move. Do not talk to anyone. I am coming to get you." Donovan had spent years spinning a very specific narrative about my mother. He told everyone, including me, that Diana was a deadbeat who lost all her money in bad investments and ran away because she could not afford to raise a child. He used that lie to gain full custody and play the hero in his social circles. But Donovan was a fool who believed his own lies. 3 hours later, a sleek black town car pulled up to the arrivals curb. A man in a dark suit stepped out, locating me immediately. He escorted me away from the commercial terminals and toward the private aviation sector. When we walked through the glass doors of the private lounge, I saw her. Diana did not look like the destitute failure Donovan had described. She wore an immaculate tailored suit, radiating power and furious authority. Through the windows behind her, a private jet sat idling on the tarmac, its engines whining in the cold air. She pulled me into a fierce, protective embrace. "You will never see that man again," she promised, kissing the top of my head. "He thinks I walked away with nothing. He has no idea that I simply reclaimed my family shipping empire. We are leaving this miserable city today." 1 week later, Donovan and his new family returned from Aspen. Sylvia marched upstairs to my bedroom, eager to assign chores. Instead, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the hallway. "No!" she shrieked. Donovan rushed up, freezing in the doorway. My room was entirely bare. The only thing remaining was a manila folder resting on the stripped mattress. Inside lay a restraining order and a document terminating his parental rights. He had lost me forever. 23 years later, it was finally time for him to lose everything else. 23 years later, the crisp wind off Lake Michigan whipped against the floor to ceiling windows of the Waldorf Astoria ballroom. I stood near the back of the crowded hall, taking a slow sip of sparkling water. At 33, I had built Vanguard Equity into a private equity titan that commanded respect across Chicago. Tonight was the annual Children's Hospital Gala, and the room overflowed with the city elite. I wore a minimalist black silk gown, devoid of excessive diamonds. Real power does not need to shout, it simply exists. I was reviewing a term sheet on my phone when someone violently shoved past my shoulder. A splash of red wine caught the edge of my sleeve. I turned, expecting a standard apology from a clumsy guest. Instead, I found myself staring at a ghost from my past. Sylvia wore a sequined dress that looked heavy enough to double as body armor. Beside her stood Madison, now 31 years old, and clutching a quilted designer handbag like it was a shield. The two women froze for a fraction of a second before Sylvia let out a loud, abrasive laugh that immediately drew the attention of the surrounding socialites. "Good Lord, Donovan!" Sylvia projected her voice so the nearby tables could hear every word. "Is your runaway daughter serving drinks tonight, or is she hunting for a sugar daddy?" Donovan stepped out from behind a group of wealthy investors. He looked me up and down, taking in my unbranded black gown and the simple gold band on my wrist. His lip curled in absolute disgust. "I told you, dropping out of our lives to live with that penniless mother of yours would leave you in the gutter." Donovan sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "We have not seen you in 23 years, Cassidy. I assumed you were working a cash register somewhere, not sneaking into charity galas to scrounge for a wealthy husband. You really have no shame, do you?" The murmurs grew louder. Several of Sylvia's friends covered their mouths, whispering to one another while pointing in my direction. Madison stepped forward, flipping her perfectly styled blonde hair over her shoulder. "Honestly, Cassidy, it is pathetic." Madison chimed in, her tone laced with fake pity. "If you needed money, you could have just called Dad. We have a reputation to maintain in this city." I did not flinch or raise my voice. The 10-year-old girl who had dialed her mother from airport security was long gone. In her place stood a woman who routinely dismantled corporate boards before breakfast. I looked at my biological father and his parasitic family, studying them the way a scientist observes an insect. "Your reputation is certainly something to behold, Donovan," I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying clearly over the chatter of the ballroom, though I suspect we have very different definitions of what it means to be an embarrassment. Sylvia scoffed loudly, turning to her friends with dramatic flair. "You see what we had to deal with. Now look at her, dressed like a funeral director and lingering by the bar. It breaks my heart to see family fall so low." Donovan puffed out his chest, attempting to look strong. "You are going to leave quietly, Cassidy. I will not have my business partners associating my name with a desperate grifter. Turn around, walk out the service elevator, and I will pretend I never saw you here tonight. Do not make me call security to have you forcibly removed from the premises." I took a slow sip of water, enjoying the absolute certainty of my position. I let the silence stretch, allowing their arrogance to swell to its absolute peak. Blinded by their own narcissism, they failed to notice the subtle shifts happening around the room. They failed to notice that the event organizers were hovering nervously nearby, waiting for my cue. Before Donovan could signal a passing security guard, the bright lights of the ballroom dimmed. A spotlight snapped onto the main stage, illuminating the gala host as he tapped the microphone. The feedback sound instantly silenced the room. Ladies and gentlemen, the host began, his voice booming through the sound system. Thank you all for your incredible generosity tonight. We have raised record-breaking funds for the pediatric ward. But before we begin the silent auction, I need to take a special moment to recognize the individual who made this entire evening possible. Sylvia puffed her chest out, whispering loudly to Madison about how Donovan Company had sponsored a table. Without this person, unmatched philanthropic vision and extraordinary corporate leadership, we would not be here, the host continued, gesturing toward the back of the room, right where I was standing. Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the back and welcome our diamond sponsor for tonight, the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Equity, Ms. Cassidy. The spotlight swung across the dark room and slammed directly onto me. Donovan froze. His jaw went slack. Sylvia dropped her wine glass. It shattered against the polished marble floor, sending red liquid splattering across her expensive shoes. Madison choked on her own breath, her eyes bulging as the entire ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. The elite investors Donovan had been trying to impress all evening immediately turned and began clapping in my direction. The wealthy socialites who had been laughing at Sylvia's cruel jokes suddenly looked at my stepmother with pure, unadulterated horror, realizing she had just publicly insulted the most powerful woman in the room. I handed my empty water glass to a passing waiter. I smoothed an invisible crease on my black silk gown. Then I looked directly into Donovan's terrified, bloodshot eyes. I smiled, a cold, razor-sharp smile that promised absolute destruction. "Excuse me, Dad," I said, my voice soft but carrying the weight of a death sentence. "I have a stage to walk to. Try not to slip on your wife-broken glass." I turned and strode toward the main stage, leaving Donovan choking on air. The walk across the ballroom felt like a victory lap. Every camera flashed, and every investor stood to shake my hand. I took the microphone from the host and looked out over the sea of faces. I kept my speech brief, thanking the hospital staff for their tireless work and announcing Vanguard Equity's formal commitment to fully funding the new pediatric wing. The applause was deafening, but my eyes remained locked on table 4. Donovan sat rigidly gripping his dinner napkin like a lifeline while Sylvia frantically dabbed at her wine-stained shoes. Madison was furiously typing on her phone, likely trying to figure out how the stepsister she had mocked for 2 decades was now the most powerful person in the room. I stepped off the stage and returned to the floor, choosing a vantage point directly behind the elite tables. The host seamlessly transitioned the evening into the live charity auction. The items were extravagant, ranging from luxury cars to private island getaways. Donovan was sweating. I could see the sheen on the back of his neck from 10 feet away. His fragile ego had just suffered a catastrophic blow in front of the very people he relied on for business loans. He needed to reassert his dominance. He needed to prove he was still the patriarch, still the wealthy titan he pretended to be. The auctioneer presented the premier item of the night, a vintage gold watch donated by a prominent local collector. The bidding started at $20,000. Paddles shot up across the room. Donovan grabbed his paddle and thrust it into the air. 30,000, he barked, his voice unnecessarily loud. Sylvia beamed beside him, straightening her posture and looking around to ensure the socialites were watching. Madison clapped her hands together, leaning into her husband Kendrick, who sat quietly analyzing the room. 40,000 came a bid from the other side of the hall. Donovan did not even hesitate. $50,000, he shouted, standing up slightly to make sure everyone saw him. $50,000 for the children. The room broke into polite applause. The auctioneer banged his wooden gavel. Sold to the gentleman at table 4 for $50,000. Donovan sat down heavily, a smug, triumphant grin plastered across his face. He shot a glaring look in my direction, as if a $50,000 watch could somehow eclipse the massive endowment I had just handed the hospital. He adjusted his jacket collar, waiting for the praise to wash over him. At these elite galas, the payment collection for high-tier items happened immediately for tax purposes and dramatic effect. A waiter in a crisp white tuxedo approached table 4 carrying a sleek portable payment terminal on a silver tray. "Congratulations, sir," the waiter said, bowing slightly. "If you could just process the payment, we will bring the watch directly to your table." Donovan scoffed, pulling a heavy platinum credit card from his leather wallet. He held it between two fingers, dangling it so the nearby tables could admire the metallic glint. He dropped it onto the tray with an arrogant flick of his wrist. "Put it through," Donovan commanded. The waiter inserted the card into the chip reader. The terminal processed for a few agonizing seconds. A sharp, unpleasant beep cut through the ambient jazz music playing in the background. "I am sorry, sir," the waiter murmured, keeping his voice low out of professional courtesy. "It seems there was an error. Let me try again." Donovan's smile faltered. He cleared his throat loudly. "Probably a security flag. The bank gets nervous when I make large, spontaneous purchases. Just run it again." The waiter ran the card a second time. Another sharp beep echoed from the machine. The screen flashed bright red. "Sir, the card is declining," the waiter said, this time a bit louder. "It says insufficient funds." The silence that descended on table 4 was absolute. The wealthy socialites sitting at table 5 and table 6 abruptly stopped talking. Heads turned, eyes darted toward Donovan. The whispers began almost instantly, a venomous hiss of gossip spreading through the ballroom like wildfire. "Try it again," Donovan hissed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "That is a platinum account. There is no limit. Run it again, or I will have your job." Sylvia grabbed Donovan's arm, her knuckles turning white. "Donovan," she whispered frantically, "give him a different card. Everyone is staring. I do not have a different card with that kind of limit on me." He snapped back, his panic rising to the surface. I stepped out of the shadows and glided toward table 4. I did not rush. I let the humiliation marinate. I let the whispers grow louder until Donovan was practically vibrating with shame. I stopped right behind his chair. The waiter looked at me, uncertain of how to proceed. I unclasped the small black clutch in my hand. I reached inside and pulled out my American Express Centurion card. The solid titanium black card caught the light. It was an invitation-only piece of metal that required millions in annual spending just to maintain. I extended my hand and dropped the heavy card directly onto the waiter's silver tray. It landed with a loud metallic clink right next to Donovan's useless platinum plastic. "Run mine," I said. My voice was calm, smooth, and completely devoid of arrogance. It was a simple business transaction. Donovan whipped his head around, his eyes wide with absolute horror. "You cannot do that," he stammered, his voice shaking. "I won the bid. This is my purchase." "Your card declined, Donovan," I replied, looking dead into his panicked eyes. "You are holding up the charity. We would not want the children to suffer because you are experiencing cash flow issues." The waiter processed the black card. It approved instantly with a pleasant chime. I picked my card back up and slipped it into my clutch. I leaned down until my lips were inches from Donovan's ear. My voice dropped to a freezing whisper, intended only for him and his stunned wife. "Consider it a tip for the $200 you left me at gate 24. I stood back up, smoothing my gown. Sylvia looked like she was going to be sick. The socialites at the neighboring tables were now openly staring, their eyes wide with shock and morbid fascination. Madison slammed her hands on the table. Her face was twisted in an ugly mask of rage and humiliation. She turned wildly to her husband sitting beside her. Kendrick did not move. He did not defend his wife. He did not confront me. Instead, Kendrick was staring down at his phone resting on his lap. The blue light from the screen illuminated his face, which had turned completely ashen. He looked like a man who had just watched a bomb detonate in slow motion. He was an African-American senior auditor at one of the top financial firms in the country, known for his brilliant analytical mind and strict adherence to logic. Kendrick did not look at Madison. He just kept staring at the financial brief glowing on his screen. His jaw clenched tight, his breathing shallow as the horrible reality of what was happening finally clicked into place. Do something! Madison hissed, her voice rising to a frantic pitch that caused the neighboring tables to flinch. Kendrick, put her in her place right now. Tell them who you are. Tell them she is just some runaway trying to steal my father's spotlight. Do your job and defend your family. Kendrick did not move a single muscle to comfort his wife. He did not reach out to hold her hand. Instead, he slowly lifted his head and let his gaze drift over Madison, Sylvia, and finally Donovan. The expression on his face was one of absolute, unadulterated disgust. It was the look of a man who had just overturned a pristine rock, only to find something rotting underneath. "Madison, shut your mouth," Kendrick said. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a commanding, icy authority that instantly silenced her. Madison gasped, stepping back as if he had physically struck her face. "Excuse me," she sputtered, looking around frantically to see who had witnessed her husband reprimanding her in public. "You cannot talk to me like that. My father is Donovan. We are the primary sponsors of this table. We belong here." "You have absolutely no idea who you are talking to," Kendrick continued, completely ignoring her tantrum. He stood up slowly, adjusting his jacket, towering over Donovan. He turned his phone screen around, but he did not show it to his wife. He shoved the device directly into my father's line of sight. Donovan squinted on the bright screen. The color rapidly drained from his face, replacing his flushed embarrassment with a sickly, pallid gray. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His hands began to tremble. "Miss Cassidy did not just pay for your $50,000 charity bid," Kendrick stated, his voice ringing with absolute clarity across the quieted section of the ballroom. "I received a priority financial brief from my partners 3 minutes ago. We have been monitoring market acquisitions all week for compliance. She did not just drop a black card to humiliate you over a vintage watch. Vanguard Equity executed a hostile takeover exactly 30 minutes before this gala began." Sylvia let out a confused, nervous laugh, gripping Donovan's sleeve with her manicured fingers. "What is he talking about, Donovan? Tell him to stop speaking nonsense right now. You own the largest commercial real estate portfolio in the financial district. You are untouchable." He owned a portfolio leveraged to the absolute brink of bankruptcy, Kendrick corrected, never taking his eyes off Donovan. And Vanguard Equity just purchased all of his outstanding debt from the overseas lenders. "Ms. Cassidy did not just pay your bill today. She just bought 51% of your commercial real estate company. She holds the shares. She is your boss." The silence that followed was absolute. The soft jazz music playing from the main stage felt entirely detached from the total devastation unfolding at table 4. The socialites who had been sneering at me minutes earlier now looked at me with a mixture of reverence and terror. I had not just embarrassed Donovan socially, I had conquered him financially, legally, and permanently. Sylvia stumbled backward, her hand flying to her throat, her heavy diamond necklace suddenly looking like a heavy collar she could no longer afford to wear. "That is impossible!" she shrieked, her voice cracking under the weight of her denial. "Donovan, tell them it is impossible. She is just a bitter child playing games. We are rich. We are the elite of this city. She is nothing." Donovan did not answer his frantic wife. He stood completely frozen, staring at the financial brief displayed on Kendrick's phone. The numbers did not lie. The corporate filings were public record now. Every building, every lease, every hollow asset he used to prop up his massive, fragile ego now belonged to the daughter he had discarded at airport security 23 years ago. His fingers went completely numb. The crystal champagne flute he had been clutching so desperately slipped from his grasp. It hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, violent crash, sending expensive vintage champagne and glass shards exploding across the toes of his polished leather shoes. He did not even flinch. He just stared down at the broken pieces, perfectly mirroring the exact state of his entire fabricated life. Madison was shaking, looking wildly between her husband, her father, and me. "But it is our company," she stammered, her arrogant facade entirely stripped away, revealing the panicked, helpless child underneath. "It belongs to us. It is my inheritance. Nothing belongs to you anymore," I said, my voice smooth and deeply resonant. I took a deliberate step forward, my heels crunching loudly over the broken glass. I did not raise my voice or gloat. I did not need to. True power is quiet. I looked at the broken, hollow man standing before me. I fixed my posture, squaring my shoulders, and leaned in just close enough for him to hear my final verdict for the evening. See you bright and early at my own office on Monday, Dad. Monday morning arrived with a brutal downpour washing over the Chicago skyline, but inside the penthouse suite of Vanguard Equity, the atmosphere was absolute ice. My office was a fortress of glass and steel meticulously designed to project quiet authority. I sat behind a massive slab of imported black marble that served as my desk reviewing a stack of acquisition files. At precisely 8 in the morning, the heavy frosted glass doors at the far end of the executive suite were violently shoved open. Donovan marched through the entrance with his face contorted in a mask of pure desperation and rage. He was flanked by Sylvia, who looked like she had not slept a single minute since the gala, and Madison, who trailed behind them with wide, terrified eyes. Two of my private security guards were right on their heels, reaching out to intercept Donovan by the shoulders. I raised a single hand, holding up my index finger. The guards immediately stopped stepping back, but remaining stationed at the door. I wanted this conversation to happen. I had waited 23 years for it. Donovan did not bother with formalities. He stormed across the expanse of the office, leaving wet footprints on the pristine white carpet, and slammed both of his clenched fists down onto my marble desk. The impact rattled the expensive espresso cup resting near my keyboard. "You think you can hostile takeover? Your own father?" Donovan roared, his voice echoing off the floor-to-ceiling windows. "You think you can just swoop in and steal my life work? Sign the 51% back to me right now, Cassidy. That business is family property. It belongs to us." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or lean away from his aggressive posture. I simply picked up my porcelain cup, took a slow, deliberate sip of my dark espresso, and turned the page of the contract I was reading. Family. I repeated, my tone conversational and utterly bored. I read the corporate bylaws, Donovan. I read the financial disclosures, the hidden offshore accounts, and the massive, unregulated lines of credit. You do not have a family business. You have a sinking ship. You leveraged the entire company to fund Sylvia's shopping addiction and your own pathetic need to look like a billionaire. You are drowning in debt. Donovan's face flushed a deep mottled red. He opened his mouth to shout another threat, but I simply tossed a thick leather-bound folder across the smooth marble surface. It slid and stopped exactly an inch from his white knuckles. "Go ahead and open it," I offered, leaning back in my ergonomic leather chair. That is the complete forensic audit my team finalized at 3 in the morning. It details exactly how many times you remortgaged your prime commercial properties to pay for Sylvia trips to Milan, her custom jewelry, and Madison luxury apartment downtown. You bled the company dry. The overseas lenders were preparing to seize all of your assets by Friday. I did not steal your life work, Donovan. I bought your garbage out of the bargain bin right before the bank threw you into the street. Sylvia let out a sharp, frantic gasp. She grabbed the edge of the desk, her knuckles turning as white as bone. "That is a lie," she hissed, her eyes darting wildly around the room as if searching for a hidden audience. "Donovan is a titan in this city. Our assets are perfectly fine. You are just a bitter, vindictive little girl making up numbers to try and humiliate us." Madison pushed past her mother, staring at the folder like it was a live explosive. "Dad," she stammered, her voice trembling with barely contained panic. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me my trust fund is secure. Kendrick has been packing his bags since Sunday night. He will not even look at me. He says we are completely insolvent. Tell me he is wrong." Donovan could not even look at his golden child. He stared blankly at the leather folder, his chest heaving with shallow, ragged breaths. The facade was finally shattering, and the reality of his total financial ruin was crashing down on him. Vanguard Equity now owned the majority share, which meant I owned the buildings, the leases, the operational control, and the mountain of catastrophic debt he had accumulated over the last 2 decades. "You have no right to do this," Donovan finally whispered, his voice stripped of all its former arrogance. "I am your father. I gave you my name. You owe me a basic level of respect." You surrendered the right to call yourself my father the second you handed a 10-year-old girl $200 and told her to walk home alone, I replied, my voice dropping to a lethal calm. You traded me for a week in Aspen. Now I am trading you for a 51% controlling interest. You are no longer the chief executive officer of your own company. You are a minority shareholder with zero voting power. As of this morning, your corporate credit cards are frozen. Your expense accounts are terminated. Your company car will be repossessed by noon. The air in the room grew completely stagnant. Madison let out a strangled sob, covering her mouth as she backed away from the desk, realizing that her entire life of unearned luxury was evaporating before her eyes. Donovan looked like he was about to physically collapse, his shoulders sagging as the crushing weight of his new reality settled over him. But Sylvia was not defeated. She was cornered, and a cornered parasite is always the most dangerous. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. Her perfectly manicured facade vanished, replaced by a feral, desperate rage. I did not even blink as Sylvia threw her body across the polished black marble. Her acrylic nails slashed through the empty air inches from my eyes. Before she could make contact, I simply rolled my ergonomic chair backward. Sylvia lost her balance. Her momentum carried her forward, and she slammed chest first onto the surface of my desk. A stack of quarterly reports scattered across the floor. The two security guards closed the distance in seconds. They grabbed Sylvia by the arms, hauling her backward and pinning her firmly against the leather sofa. She thrashed wildly, her face contorted in an ugly mask of feral desperation. "You owe us!" she shrieked, spit flying from her lips. "We gave you a roof over your head. We gave you the gift of life, you wretched little parasite." I adjusted the cuffs of my blazer. "You gave me discarded clothes and frozen dinners, Sylvia. My mother gave me the gift of life. You just gave me a master class in how to spot a gold digger from 50 paces away. Now sit down and keep your mouth shut before I have you arrested for attempted assault." The room descended into silence, broken only by Sylvia's ragged breathing as the guards forced her onto the sofa. Donovan stood frozen, looking older and more hollow than I had ever seen him. He was broken, staring at the floor as the reality of his financial ruin set in. But Madison was a different breed of delusional. She still believed she held some kind of leverage. She still believed the rules did not apply to her. Madison smoothed the front of her cashmere sweater, ignoring her mother's meltdown. She reached into her quilted designer handbag and pulled out a thick, glossy folder. She marched up to my desk, her chin raised in an absurd display of unearned confidence, and slapped the folder down onto the black marble. "Since you suddenly have so much money," Madison said, her voice dripping with entitlement, "you can make yourself useful for once in your miserable life. That is my new business plan. I am expanding my luxury boutique into the international market. I need an initial capital injection of $2 million to secure a flagship storefront in Paris. $2 million is nothing for you now. Consider it your duty as a sister." I looked at the glossy folder, then slowly looked up at Madison. The sheer audacity of her demand was impressive. She was standing in the office of a woman who had just orchestrated the hostile takeover of her father's entire corporate empire. A woman her family had verbally abused and abandoned decades ago, and she was demanding a $2 million handout like it was her birthright. I let out a low, cold laugh that echoed off the glass walls. "You want me to fund your luxury boutique?" I asked, tapping my manicured fingernail against the cover of the folder. "You walk into my building after insulting me at a charity gala, after watching me dismantle your father's lifework, and you demand $2 million for a vanity project." Madison crossed her arms over her chest, tapping her foot impatiently. "We are family, Cassidy," she snapped, rolling her eyes as if I were simply being slow to understand basic logic. "You owe us. You humiliated Dad in public. The least you can do is support my entrepreneurial vision. Besides, my boutique is highly exclusive. It is a premium brand. You should be begging to invest in it before it goes global." I did not bother opening the folder. I did not even look at the financial projections she had presumably paid someone else to fabricate. Instead, I picked up the glossy business plan turned to my right and dropped it directly into the heavy-duty industrial paper shredder sitting beside my desk. The machine roared to life violently, chewing through the thick cardstock and spitting it out as worthless confetti. Madison shrieked, lunging forward, as if she could pull the shredded documents back together. "What is wrong with you?" she screamed. "That cost me $5,000 to have professionally designed, you absolute psycho!" I took another sip of my espresso, savoring the bitter taste of the dark roast. "Your boutique is not a premium brand, Madison. It is a fraudulent front. You have not sold a single dress handbag or pair of shoes in 8 consecutive months. I know this because my analysts reviewed your commercial lease when we audited your father's subsidiaries. Your inventory has been sitting in a dusty warehouse untouched since last spring." Madison's face drained of all color. Her arrogant posture immediately crumbled, replaced by a sudden frantic terror. "You use that fake boutique to justify your supposed business trips," I continued, my voice slicing through the room with surgical precision. "But more importantly, you use it as a shell company to siphon money directly out of Kendrick's personal bank accounts. You have been funneling his hard-earned salary into your failing business to cover your massive credit card debt and pay off your secret shopping addiction. You are stealing from your own husband to maintain the illusion that you are a successful businesswoman." The truth hit the room like a physical shockwave. Donovan finally looked up, his jaw slack. Sylvia stopped thrashing against the security guards. Madison was trembling violently, her eyes darting toward the heavy glass doors of the executive suite. Her perfectly constructed lie had just been annihilated. Driven by blind panic and raw humiliation, Madison grabbed the hot cup of coffee resting on the edge of my desk. She let out an animalistic scream, rearing her arm back to throw the scalding liquid directly into my face. But the cup never left her hand. A strong hand shot out from behind her, gripping her wrist mid-air with bone-crushing force. The coffee sloshed over the rim, burning her fingers. Madison gasped and spun. It was Kendrick. The scalding dark liquid splashed harmlessly onto the pristine white carpet, narrowly missing the edge of my marble desk. Kendrick stood there, his fingers locked like a steel vise around his wife's wrist. He had walked through the frosted glass doors moments earlier, carrying a thick leather briefcase in his left hand, arriving just in time to witness his wife's violent tantrum. Madison let out a sharp cry of pain, struggling to free herself from his iron grip. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and brimming with sudden tears. Kendrick did not flinch. He did not loosen his hold. His face was a mask of absolute chilling indifference. With a swift, deliberate motion, he wrenched the ceramic cup from her trembling fingers and set it firmly on the desk. He pushed her hand away, stepping past her as if she were nothing more than an obstacle. Madison stumbled backward, clutching her wrist. She stared at him in utter disbelief. "Kendrick!" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the expansive office. "What are you doing? Defend me! Look at what she is doing to us! She is ruining our family!" Kendrick slowly turned his head to look at her. He adjusted his impeccably tailored navy suit jacket, his expression radiating pure disgust. "You do not have a family, Madison," he stated, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "You have a cartel of narcissists. And as for your boutique, Ms. Cassidy is completely correct. I have known about your embezzlement scheme for 3 months. I tracked every single fraudulent transfer you made from our joint accounts to your fake corporate front. My attorneys are filing the divorce papers as we speak, along with a civil suit for grand larceny." Madison opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The arrogant, entitled daughter who had spent her entire life stepping on others was suddenly suffocating in the vacuum of her own consequences. She sank onto the edge of the leather sofa beside her hyperventilating mother, completely paralyzed by reality. Kendrick turned his attention away from his soon-to-be ex-wife. He stepped forward and placed his heavy leather briefcase onto the black marble surface of my desk. He clicked the brass locks open, the sharp metallic snaps echoing loudly in the silent room. He reached inside and retrieved a massive, thick audit binder, dropping it onto the table with a resounding thud. "I was not just monitoring my own bank accounts," Kendrick announced, directing his cold, unblinking gaze entirely onto his father-in-law. "I was hired by Vanguard Equity to conduct the forensic audit of your entire corporate structure. They brought my firm in 3 weeks ago to execute a microscopic review of your ledgers. Donovan stared blankly at the massive leather-bound binder resting on the desk. The color had already drained completely from his face, but now he looked as though he might actually physically collapse. His aging skin took on a sickly, translucent gray pallor. "Your company is not just bankrupt, Donovan," Kendrick continued, his voice ringing with absolute clinical precision. "Bankruptcy is a civil matter. Bankruptcy implies poor business decisions and market fluctuations. What you have done goes far beyond gross negligence. You have been systematically embezzling from your own employees' pension fund for 4 consecutive years." Sylvia gasped, a sharp, ragged intake of air that sounded like she was choking. She stared at her husband, her eyes wide with a new, distinct flavor of terror. She knew exactly what pension embezzlement meant. It was not a slap on the wrist. It was not a quiet settlement. You diverted over $14 million from the retirement accounts of your warehouse workers, your administrative staff, and your middle management, Kendrick stated, pointing a sharp finger at the binder. You used shell companies and falsified vendor invoices to siphon the money directly into your offshore accounts. You stole their life savings to maintain your country club memberships and cover the interest on your collapsing commercial loans. "That is a lie," Donovan croaked, his voice cracking, but his trembling hands betrayed his guilt. "My accountants handle the pension distributions. I do not monitor those specific ledgers." "Do not insult my intelligence," Kendrick snapped back, leaning over the desk. "I found your digital signatures on every single transfer authorization. I tracked the routing numbers to the accounts in the Cayman Islands. I have the emails you sent to your chief financial officer, instructing him to alter the quarterly reports to hide the deficits. The audit trail is absolutely irrefutable. You did not just bankrupt your company, you committed massive systemic corporate fraud." I sat quietly in my chair watching the destruction unfold. Kendrick had executed his part of the plan flawlessly. I had hired him specifically because I knew he was meticulous, and because I knew he despised the family he had married into just as much as I did. Vanguard Equity has already submitted this entire binder to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Department of Labor, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Kendrick concluded, stepping back and folding his arms across his chest. You are not just looking at a total loss of your assets, Donovan. You are facing 20 years in federal prison. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The sound of the relentless rain beating against the floor-to-ceiling windows filled the void. Donovan looked at the binder, then at Kendrick, and finally at me. He was a man who had built his entire identity on control, intimidation, and wealth. Now every single pillar of his existence had been annihilated in the span of a single morning. He was utterly and completely trapped. The frosted exit doors were firmly blocked by my private security. His vast finances were fully frozen. His crimes were heavily documented and delivered to the federal authorities. He was staring down the barrel of a multi-decade prison sentence with absolutely no viable means of defending himself today. But a true narcissist never simply accepts total defeat. When stripped of all logic, wealth, and worldly power, they immediately revert to their most primal, vicious instincts. They search for the one emotional vulnerability they can actively exploit. Donovan altered his stance and his posture suddenly shifted. The violent trembling in his hands stopped completely. His panic morphed into a cold, terrifying stillness. He slowly straightened his spine, pulling his shoulders back as a dark, knowing smirk crept across his face. He looked directly into my eyes, realizing he was cornered, and decided to pull his final desperate card. Donovan's dark, knowing smirk was suddenly interrupted by a high-pitched, dramatically theatrical wail. Sylvia, realizing that federal prison meant the absolute end of her designer wardrobe, threw herself completely off the leather sofa and collapsed onto the pristine white carpet. She began to violently thrash her limbs while clutching at her chest and gasping for air in a desperately exaggerated display of a panic attack. Her heavy diamond bracelets clanked loudly against the polished floor as she writhed. "I cannot breathe!" Sylvia shrieked, her voice cracking as she clawed frantically at the collar of her silk blouse. "You are a monster, Cassidy. Look at what you are doing. You are trying to send your own father to jail. You are a cold, heartless psychopath. Somebody call an ambulance right now. She is murdering her own family." Madison immediately dropped to her bare knees beside her mother, her face totally streaked with ruined mascara, completely ignoring the fact that Kendrick had just announced his intention to divorce her. She shot venomous, hateful glares in my direction while desperately pleading with the security guards to help. The private guards simply looked at me, waiting for a command. I simply gave them a subtle nod to stay exactly where they were. Kendrick just adjusted his leather briefcase and stepped back, his face a chilling mask of supreme disgust. Donovan did not spare a single fleeting glance for his hyperventilating wife or his sobbing daughter. His eyes remained locked on mine, gleaming with a toxic, revitalized arrogance. He stepped right over Sylvia, thrashing legs, moving closer to the edge of my black marble desk. The crushing reality of his embezzlement and impending prison sentence completely evaporated from his posture. He was back in his element, operating purely on pure spite. "You think you have backed me into a corner?" Donovan sneered, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly tone. "You think because you bought up my debt and brought your little attack dog here to read my ledgers that you have actually won. You push me, I push back Cassidy." He reached a slow, deliberate hand into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He withdrew a thick, crumpled, tri-folded document. The paper was visibly yellowed at the edges, stiff and aged, looking entirely out of place in my pristine, modern office. With a dramatic flick of his wrist, he snapped the document open and slammed it flat onto the center of the black marble desk, right next to Kendrick's audit binder. "I kept this safely locked in a private safety deposit box for over 2 decades," Donovan stated, leaning his weight onto his palms as he towered over my desk. "That is the original unrevoked will of your dead mother, Diana. She drafted this exactly 3 weeks before she realized I was leaving her for Sylvia. It was her final legally binding directive regarding her personal family estate. I kept my expression entirely neutral. Sylvia, dramatic gasping, suddenly quieted down into a pathetic whimper as she strained to listen from the floor. Madison stopped crying, looking up at her father with renewed hope. Donovan tapped his index finger aggressively against a specific faded paragraph near the bottom of the page. "Diana came from Old Money Cassidy. She left me a $20 million trust in this document before she realized I was leaving her. She named me as the sole beneficiary of her primary investment portfolio because at the time we were happily married. As your legal father and her widower on paper at the time of the draft, I retain absolute executive control over those assets." He stood up straight, smoothing his tie with a triumphant, predatory smile. "I know exactly how you built Vanguard Equity. You used the seed money from your mother's secondary accounts to launch your first firm. But according to this unrevoked will, that initial capital never belonged to you. It belonged to me. I am claiming your entire initial capital, Cassidy. I am claiming the seed money, the compounding interest, and every single corporate asset you acquired." Donovan began to pace the length of my desk, his chest puffed out, radiating unchecked narcissism. He truly believed he had just delivered the killing blow, finding the legal loophole that would not only save him from federal prison, but would transfer my entire life work directly into his greedy hands. "My lawyers will file an injunction by noon," Donovan boasted, his voice rising in volume and confidence. "They will freeze Vanguard Equity completely. They will invalidate your hostile takeover of my company because the funds you used to purchase my debt were legally mine to begin with. You tried to ruin me, but you just handed me the keys to your kingdom. I will leave you with absolutely nothing, just like I did 23 years ago." Sylvia scrambled up from the cold floor, her fake panic attack instantly forgotten. She brushed the lint off her silk blouse and let out a breathless, triumphant laugh. She linked her arm tightly through Donovan, glaring at me with vicious superiority. "We are going to take everything," she spat. I stared down at the crumpled yellow document resting on the black marble. The room was spinning with their sudden, overwhelming arrogance. I slowly raised my head to look at Donovan. I let my eyes widen just slightly, ensuring he saw the precise moment the panic seemed to set in. I drew in a short, ragged breath. I lowered my hands to the surface of the desk, letting my fingertips rest against the cold stone, and I forced them to tremble. It was a microscopic movement, a subtle vibration of my hands, but Donovan caught it instantly. His smile widened into a gruesome, victorious grin. He thought he had broken me. He thought he had finally won. But my trembling was nothing more than a deliberate, flawless performance designed to fool them all before I dropped the actual absolute hammer. Donovan watched my fingertips tremble against the black marble. His chest puffed out, inflating with the toxic air of a man who believed he had just cheated the hangman. The silence in the office was broken by his low, menacing chuckle. It was the same laugh I remembered from my childhood whenever he found a way to crush the spirit of my mother or belittle my accomplishments. He tapped the yellowed document with absolute certainty. I kept my breathing shallow, my eyes fixed on the aged paper, feeding him exactly the reaction his bloated ego required to function. "You thought you were so clever, Cassidy," he sneered, leaning closer so I could smell the stale coffee and expensive cologne on his breath. "You spent all these years building your little empire, plotting your grand revenge, and you completely forgot who you were dealing with. I am Donovan. I built this city while you were still playing with dolls. I do not lose." Sylvia, emboldened by the sudden resurrection of her husband, stepped up beside him. Her earlier panic attack was entirely gone, replaced by a venomous, triumphant sneer. She looked down her nose at me, her diamond earrings catching the light. "We told you, you miserable little brat. You are nothing compared to us. You thought you could just waltz in here and take what belongs to my family. Now you are going to lose every single penny you ever made." Donovan silenced his wife with a sharp raise of his hand. He wanted the spotlight entirely on himself for the final blow. He leaned over the desk, his face inches from mine. "I am taking you to civil court tomorrow morning for emergency mediation," he stated, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable confidence. "You have two choices, and I suggest you listen very carefully, because I will not repeat myself. Option 1, you sign over the 51% controlling interest of my company back to me immediately. You bury this ridiculous forensic audit your little attack dog conducted, and you wipe my debt entirely clean. You will sign a non-disclosure agreement forbidding you from ever speaking of this to the press, the board, or the federal authorities." Madison, recovering her typical arrogance, scoffed loudly from the sofa. "And you will fund my Paris expansion," she added, glaring at Kendrick before turning her venom back to me. $2 million deposited by the end of the week. Consider it your penalty for putting my mother through that emotional distress." Donovan ignored his daughter, his eyes remaining locked on my intentionally widened gaze. "Option 2, he continued, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I execute this unrevoked will. I tie up Vanguard equity in a massive, highly publicized legal battle. I will have the courts freeze every single asset you own, every bank account, every stock portfolio, every property. You will not be able to buy a cup of coffee without my permission. I will drag this out until your investors abandon you and your company bleeds to death." I let my shoulders slump forward just a fraction of an inch, biting my lower lip as if struggling to hold back a wave of absolute despair. The visual confirmation of my defeat was exactly what Donovan needed. He snatched the yellow document off the black marble, folded it with sharp, aggressive movements, and tucked it safely back into his breast pocket. He patted the fabric, securing his stolen leverage. "I will have my lawyers draft the transfer documents tonight," Donovan commanded, turning his back to me. "Have your legal team meet us at the courthouse at 9 in the morning. Do not be late, Cassidy. I despise waiting." Sylvia linked her arm through his, her posture radiating arrogant superiority. She looked around my pristine executive suite, her eyes lingering on the expensive artwork and custom furniture. "We might just keep this office for James when he graduates," she remarked casually, as if I had already been evicted. Madison pushed herself off the leather sofa, adjusting her cashmere sweater. She cast one final hateful glare at Kendrick, who stood silently by the door. "You are going to regret choosing her side?" Kendrick, Madison spat. "You are going to be left with nothing." The three of them turned and marched toward the frosted glass doors. My security guard stepped aside, allowing them to pass. They walked out of the executive suite like victorious conquerors, their heads held high, entirely convinced they had just executed the greatest power play of their lives. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind them, sealing the office in sudden, absolute quiet. The click of the magnetic lock echoed off the marble floor. I waited exactly 3 seconds. Once the doors were secured, the manufactured panic instantly vanished from my face. My slumping shoulders squared. My trembling hands steadied completely resting firmly against the cool stone of my desk. I leaned back into the deep comfort of my ergonomic leather chair, letting out a long, slow breath. I raised my hands and steepled my fingers together, resting them beneath my chin. I looked across the room at Kendrick. He had not moved from his position near the door, his posture still rigid, his expression an unreadable mask of corporate professionalism. Slowly, the corner of his mouth twitched upward into a sharp, knowing smile. He reached down, picked up his heavy leather briefcase, and walked back toward my desk, taking a seat in the plush leather guest chair opposite me. "They took the bait flawlessly," I said, my voice smooth, resonant, and entirely stripped of the fear I had been projecting moments earlier. Kendrick opened his briefcase, pulling out a sleek silver laptop and setting it on the marble next to the massive audit binder. They swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. He agreed, typing his password into the machine. Donovan has absolutely no idea what he just walked into. His blinding arrogance is his complete undoing. 30 miles away from the quiet triumph of my executive suite, the atmosphere inside Donovan's expansive suburban mansion was a grotesque display of premature victory. The heavy mahogany double doors of his private estate had barely clicked shut before the celebration commenced. Sylvia immediately made a beeline for the custom-built marble wet bar situated perfectly in the center of their sunken living room. She bypassed the standard liquor cabinet and reached directly for the temperature-controlled wine fridge, retrieving a chilled bottle of imported vintage champagne that cost easily $500. The resounding pop of the cork echoed. The sharp sound served as the official starting gun for their collective delusion. Donovan threw his tailored suit jacket over the back of a plush velvet armchair and loosened his expensive silk tie. He poured himself a generous measure of aged scotch, completely ignoring the champagne his wife was currently splashing into crystal flutes. He paced across the imported Persian rug, his chest puffed out like a conquering general, returning from a glorious battlefield. His eyes darted around his lavish home, absorbing the expensive artwork and the custom chandeliers as if he had just rescued them from a burning building. Madison had already collapsed onto the oversized, curved sectional sofa, entirely forgetting the impending divorce her husband had announced just hours prior. She kicked off her designer heels and flipped open her rose gold laptop screen. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she immediately navigated to an exclusive luxury car dealership website. She did not even bother looking at the entry-level models. She went straight to the custom configuration page for a brand new Porsche. She selected a metallic pearl white exterior and began adding premium leather interior options with an attitude of absolute and reckless financial abandon. "We completely broke her," Madison gloated, her eyes glued to the laptop screen as she clicked to upgrade the sound system. "Did you see the look on her stupid face when Dad slammed that will down on the desk?" She was absolutely petrified. That arrogant ice queen actually thought she could bankrupt us and walk away clean. Now she is going to be paying for my new car, my boutique expansion, and probably my next 3 vacations. I am going to make sure she covers the premium delivery fee for this Porsche too, just to make her suffer even more. Sylvia glided across the room, handing a brimming crystal flute to her daughter before taking a long, victorious sip from her own glass. She leaned against the back of the sofa, smiling a venomous, saccharine smile. "I told you, Donovan," Sylvia declared, her voice echoing with supreme manufactured authority. "Blood ties always win." She is terrified of losing her precious money. She spent her entire pathetic life trying to prove she was better than us, and it only took one single piece of paper to bring her crashing completely down. Tomorrow we take everything from that little brat for good. Donovan swallowed his scotch in one swift gulp and slammed the heavy glass tumbler down onto the nearest mahogany side table. He let out a harsh, booming laugh that filled the expansive room. "She actually thought she had outsmarted me," Donovan sneered, pointing a sharp finger at his wife. "She thought buying up my commercial debt and auditing my ledgers would magically erase the fact that I am the one who built this family wealth. Tomorrow I will not just take back my massive company. I will strip Vanguard equity down to the studs and leave her with absolutely nothing. I will seize her entire corporate infrastructure and absorb her client list," Donovan bragged, pacing furiously. I will legally bind her to a non-compete clause so tight she will never work in finance again. By the time I am finished with her, she will be begging me for an entry-level accounting position." Madison laughed a shrill grating sound that bounced off the marble floors. "I want her penthouse downtown," Madison demanded, typing aggressively. "When you seize her assets, Dad, make sure you transfer the deed to her penthouse directly into my name before the week is completely over. It has a much better view of the skyline than my current place, and I need the extra closet space for my new wardrobe," Madison continued. Sylvia nodded in vigorous agreement, taking another sip of champagne. "We deserve compensation for the emotional distress she caused us today. I want her private security detail fired and replaced with our own people. I want her frozen out of the country club entirely. We need to make a firm example out of her so the rest of the board members understand exactly who is in charge of this city and our entire family." They continued to build their fantasy world, adding layer upon layer of imagined revenge and financial ruin. They divided my assets, claimed my properties, and spent my money with the breathless excitement of lottery winners who had not yet cashed their ticket. They were so deeply intoxicated by their own narcissism and the intoxicating rush of perceived power that they completely failed to notice the silent figure standing in the arched doorway of the living room. Kendrick stood perfectly still, his tailored navy suit jacket draped casually over one arm, watching the grotesque celebration unfolding before him with cold detachment. He watched his wife casually configure a sports car using stolen funds. He watched his mother-in-law drink champagne to celebrate the destruction of her stepdaughter. He watched his father-in-law boast about corporate dominance while staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. Their absolute disconnect from reality was staggering. They had just confessed to massive corporate fraud in front of an auditor. Kendrick did not say a single word. He simply turned around and walked silently down the hallway toward the master suite. He pulled a duffel bag from the closet and quietly packed his bags. The neon sign of the Midnight Diner flickered against the wet asphalt, casting long red shadows across the empty parking lot. It was nearly 2 in the morning, and the relentless rain showed absolutely no signs of stopping. I sat alone in a faded vinyl booth near the back of the narrow restaurant, a half-empty mug of black coffee resting on the formica table in front of me. The bell above the glass entrance door jingled sharply. Kendrick walked inside, shaking the heavy rain from his dark trench coat. He carried a heavy canvas duffel bag slung over his left shoulder. He did not look like a man who had just dismantled his entire marriage. He looked like a soldier reporting for his next critical assignment. He spotted me immediately and walked down the narrow aisle, sliding into the booth across from me. He dropped the duffel bag onto the cracked linoleum floor with a heavy thud. The late-night waitress approached with a coffee pot, but Kendrick waved her away with a polite shake of his head. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, his expression grave and urgent. "I just left the house," Kendrick stated, his voice low enough to avoid carrying to the only other patron sitting at the counter. "They are currently dividing your assets like greedy pirates dividing plunder. Madison is buying a Porsche. Sylvia is planning an office remodel, and Donovan is on the phone with his legal team preparing the injunction for tomorrow morning." "Let them celebrate," I replied smoothly, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "Delusion is a highly effective anesthetic." "Cassidy, this is not a game," Kendrick warned, his dark eyes locking onto mine with intense seriousness. "The signature on that will is real. I ran a quiet verification on that document through my firm the moment I left your office today. I checked it against Diana's historical banking records. The notary seal is legitimate, and the date predates her formal separation from Donovan by exactly 20 full days. If he submits that document to the judge tomorrow morning, your assets will be locked in probate for years." I set my coffee mug down on the saucer. I did not break eye contact. "He will request an immediate freeze on Vanguard equity," Kendrick continued, his voice tight with genuine concern. "He will argue that the seed money you used to build your firm was legally his property stolen from his marital assets. Civil court judges despise messy probate disputes. They will grant the injunction just to keep the assets entirely secure until a full investigation concludes. Your firm will be paralyzed, your clients will panic. Donovan knows he cannot beat you in a fair fight, so he is dragging you into a legal swamp where he can bleed you dry. Kendrick paused, taking a deep breath before delivering his ultimate proposal. I will not let that happen to you. I will testify about the pension fraud tomorrow morning to protect you. I will walk into that civil mediation and hand the judge the complete forensic audit binder. I will accelerate the FBI timeline and personally testify that Donovan embezzled $14 million from his own employees. That will instantly destroy his credibility and invalidate any civil claim he tries to make against you. If you do that, I pointed out calmly, Donovan will realize you are the one who conducted the audit. He will retaliate by dragging your name into the mud. He will accuse you of corporate espionage and breach of fiduciary duty. You could easily lose your license. I do not care about my license right now, Kendrick replied fiercely. You gave me the opportunity to expose these monsters. You gave me the chance to walk away from Madison with my dignity intact. I am not going to sit by and watch Donovan use a 20-year-old technicality to destroy everything you built. I will fall on my sword if it means putting that bastard behind bars tomorrow. I looked at the man sitting across from me. Kendrick was meticulous, brilliant, and fiercely loyal. He was ready to detonate his own professional career just to ensure Donovan did not escape justice. I reached across the table and placed my hand briefly over his. I appreciate your loyalty, Kendrick, I said quietly, but I absolutely do not need you to fall on your sword. Kendrick frowned in confusion. Cassidy, if I do not present that audit, Donovan is going to drop that will on the judge's desk. He is going to claim your initial capital. I slowly withdrew my hand from his and smiled warmly. Donovan operates entirely on greed and assumption. When he found that unrevoked will in my mother's safety deposit box 2 decades ago, he saw the $20 million trust allocation and immediately stopped reading. He assumed he had found a golden ticket. He assumed my mother, a woman he fundamentally underestimated his entire life, had simply forgotten to update her paperwork before she died. He has spent 20 years believing he held the ultimate unbreakable trump card over my head. Kendrick stared at me, his brow furrowing as he tried to decipher my complete lack of concern. What are you saying the document is legally binding? It gives him executive control over her primary investment portfolio. If he officially activates it tomorrow, you are completely ruined. I have been patiently waiting for over 2 years for him to finally produce that specific document in a formal legal setting. I replied, my voice dropping to a calm, clinical whisper. I shook my head, pulling a red folder from my bag. I don't need you to testify about the fraud, Kendrick. I need you to read page 4 of Diana's actual estate ledger. Kendrick reads the document. His eyes widen in shock, and a slow, brilliant smile spreads across his face. My God, you're going to let him submit it, aren't you? The heavy oak doors of the downtown civil court mediation room swung open at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, echoing loudly. I sat completely still in the high-backed leather chair on the far side of the long, polished mahogany table. My hands were folded very neatly in my lap. My face was a completely blank, unreadable slate. The silent room smelled of lemon polish and stale legal volumes. Donovan entered the room like a victorious, conquering king returning to his rightful throne room. Sylvia strutted in right behind him, smirking. She wore a tailored scarlet dress and had deliberately draped herself in excessive heavy diamond necklaces and matching tennis bracelets. The jewels clanked together loudly with every step she took. They were closely accompanied by a man who radiated the exact same flavor of toxic arrogance. This man was Richard Sterling, a notoriously vicious corporate litigator who charged thousands of dollars an hour. Donovan did not even bother looking at me as he took his seat. Sylvia took the chair next to him, glaring across the table at me with absolute contempt. She purposefully adjusted her wrist, making sure her largest diamond bracelet caught the overhead fluorescent light. You look surprisingly calm for someone about to lose her entire corporate empire. Sylvia sneered loudly, breaking the quiet formality of the room. I suppose sudden shock does that to a person. It completely paralyzes the brain. Do not worry at all, Cassidy. I will be sure to send you a postcard from Paris when I spend your little investment fund. I did not blink. I did not respond. I simply kept my eyes fixed on the mediator, a stern-looking retired judge named Collins, who sat at the head of the table shuffling through a stack of preliminary paperwork. Mediator Collins adjusted her reading glasses and cleared her throat, signaling the official start of the proceedings. We are here today to discuss the emergency injunction filed by Donovan Hayes against Vanguard Equity and its managing director Cassidy Hayes. Mediator Collins stated, her voice dry and clinical. Mr. Sterling, you have requested immediate intervention regarding disputed assets. The floor is yours. Sterling stood up slowly, buttoning his expensive suit jacket. He opened his sleek leather briefcase and extracted the familiar yellowed, tri-folded document. With a dramatic sweeping gesture, he slid the aged paper across the polished mahogany surface until it rested directly in front of the mediator. My client is presenting the original unrevoked will of his late wife, Diana Hayes. Sterling announced, his voice projecting across the room with theatrical authority. This document clearly designates Donovan Hayes as the sole executor and primary beneficiary of a $20 million private trust. Furthermore, financial tracing unequivocally proves that the seed money used to establish Vanguard Equity was illegally funneled from these exact trust accounts without my client knowing. Sterling leaned his knuckles on the table, fixing me with a predatory glare. Therefore, my client demands the immediate execution of this trust in its entirety. We demand full relinquishment of Vanguard Equity, hostile takeover of Hayes Manufacturing. We require an immediate transfer of the 51% controlling interest back to Donovan Hayes and a permanent restraining order preventing Cassidy Hayes from executing any further forensic audits or financial inquiries into his businesses. Donovan smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. You overplayed your hand, Cassidy, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. You thought you could use your mother money to destroy me. But Diana always knew her place in the end. She knew who the real provider was. She drafted that will because she understood that women like you and her are too emotional to handle real wealth. You should have stayed in your lane. Now you are going to walk out of this building with absolutely nothing. Sylvia let out a very sharp, cruel, mocking laugh. She is going to have to sell that fancy penthouse just to pay her mounting legal fees, Donovan. We should buy it today and use it as a luxury guest house for our dogs. Mediator Collins frowned at the interruption, raising her hand to restore order. She pulled the yellowed document closer, putting on her glasses to examine the signature and the notary seal. The room fell into a tense, expectant silence. The only sound was the rustling of the heavy paper as the mediator turned the page. I watched Donovan's chest rise and fall with steady, confident breaths. He truly believed he had secured his financial salvation. He believed he had permanently silenced me. After several long, agonizing minutes of careful review, Mediator Collins removed her glasses and looked directly at me. Her expression was completely serious. Miss Hayes, she began, her tone measured and cautious. This document appears to meet all the legal requirements for a valid binding will. The notary seal is intact, and the dates align with the timeline provided by opposing counsel. However, given the sudden appearance of this document after 2 decades, you have the absolute right to challenge its authenticity. We can order a full handwriting analysis. We can subpoena the notary. We can stall this injunction while your legal team investigates for forgery or coercion. Donovan leaned forward, a vicious sneer forming on his lips. He was ready for a fight. He wanted to watch me struggle and bleed legal fees for months while my company remained frozen in corporate purgatory. Do you wish to formally contest the validity of your mother will? Mediator Collins asked, pen poised over her official mediation record. I sat forward slowly. I unclasped my hands and placed them flat on the smooth mahogany table. I looked at Sylvia's smug, diamond-covered face. I looked at Sterling's arrogant posture. Finally, I locked my eyes entirely on Donovan. I let the silence stretch for 5 seconds. No, I replied, my voice echoing clearly and decisively through the quiet room. The signature on the will is absolutely authentic. I concede. Mediator Collins froze her pen suspended above the thick legal pad. The profound silence in the mahogany room was absolute. Richard Sterling, a lawyer who charged thousands an hour, blinked twice. Donovan leaned back, supreme satisfaction washing over his flushed face. He expected me to fight to protect the empire I had built. My surrender was the ultimate validation of his belief that I was weak. Sensing victory, Sylvia put on a theatrical display for the mediator, reaching into her handbag to produce a silk handkerchief. She dabbed delicately at her perfectly dry eyes, sniffing loudly. "We just want what is fair for our family," Sylvia said, her voice dripping with artificial sorrow. "Cassidy has been so lost since she left us. She tried to steal her father's legacy just to punish us for loving her. We are not trying to be cruel today. We are just taking back what Donovan built. We are trying to restore the natural order of this family." Mediator Collins ignored Sylvia, keeping her stern gaze fixed on me. "Miss Hayes, you must understand the gravity of this concession. By waiving your right to contest, you legally surrender executive control. You validate his claim that Vanguard equity was drawn from these specific funds, making the firm an asset of the estate." "I understand perfectly," I replied, my voice stripped of any emotion. "Execute the will." Sterling wasted no time. He moved with the ruthless efficiency of a shark smelling blood. He snapped his briefcase open and pulled out a stack of pre-drafted legal acceptance forms. He slid them across the table. "These documents officially bind all parties to the terms of Diana's last will," Sterling declared rapidly. "This document constitutes a formal transfer of the estate, cementing Donovan Hayes as the sole executor and primary beneficiary. It legally transfers all associated assets and corporate entities tied to the trust directly into his name, effective this very second." Donovan snatched the gold fountain pen from the table. He did not bother reading a single line. His ego made him believe he was invincible. He pressed the pen to the paper forcefully. Donovan aggressively signed the legal acceptance of the will and the transfer of the estate, legally binding himself to Diana's legacy. He claimed his ultimate victory over the woman he had crushed. When he reached the final page, Donovan shoved the paper toward me. The thick packet skidded across the table and stopped inches from my folded hands. "Sign it, you failure," Donovan spat. He leaned over the table, his face twisted with arrogant triumph. "You spent years trying to prove you were smarter than me. You built that corporate tower and thought you were a titan. But you are exactly like your mother. Weak, emotional, and utterly incapable. Sign the paper, Cassidy. Hand over the keys to your firm and get out of my sight before I take your personal bank accounts, too." Sylvia leaned against his shoulder, her diamonds clinking loudly. "You should have stayed in your lane. Now you have to start over from the bottom. Maybe Madison can hire you as a receptionist at her new boutique." I looked down at the documents. My name was printed on the final signature line. It was the last barrier between Donovan and total control. I reached out and picked up the gold pen. My hand did not tremble. I did not look at Donovan, Sylvia, or the predatory lawyer. I signed it with a smooth stroke of my pen. Sterling reached across the table to retrieve the documents, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of a massive billable victory. I held my hand up, resting my palm flat against the freshly signed paperwork. I prevented him from pulling it away. "Not just yet, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through the thick air of the room like a freshly sharpened blade. Then I slid a second document from my briefcase. It was the exact same bright red folder Kendrick and I had reviewed the night before. I placed it gently on top of the newly signed execution documents. I opened the cover, revealing a dense, heavily annotated financial ledger covered in my mother's meticulous handwriting. "What is this nonsense?" Donovan demanded, his face turning an angry shade of crimson. "The mediation is over. You signed the papers. Vanguard is mine." I finally looked up, locking my eyes onto Donovan. The manufactured fear I had maintained for weeks vanished completely. A slow, razor-sharp smile spread across my face. "Congratulations, Dad," I said, my voice ringing with absolute lethal clarity. "You just legally inherited Diana's estate, including its liabilities." Donovan frowned, his arrogant smirk faltering for the very first time. "Liabilities? What liabilities? Mediator Collins pulled the red folder toward her, slipping her reading glasses back onto her face. Her eyes widened as she scanned the first page. I leaned back, folding my hands together. When my mother drafted that will 20 years ago, she did not just place 20 million into a trust. She used that specific trust as collateral to guarantee the pension fund for Hayes Manufacturing. The exact same pension fund you completely drained and embezzled 14 million from over the last decade. You stole it to fund Sylvia's jewelry habit and Madison's lifestyle. Donovan froze. The color drained from his face so fast he looked ill. Sterling snatched the red folder from the mediator, his eyes darting frantically across the ledger. As long as the will remained unexecuted, the liability remained in legal limbo, I explained calmly. But you just demanded the immediate execution of the trust. You just legally bound yourself as the sole executor of the estate. Which means as of 30 seconds ago, you are personally and legally responsible for the $14 million deficit in the corporate pension fund. Sterling dropped the folder as if it were on fire. He backed away, his professional demeanor shattering. He lied to me, Sterling stammered. My client failed to disclose this liability. I stood up, buttoning my blazer. The FBI received the complete audit of the pension fraud at 8 this morning. They were waiting for this mediation to conclude to see who officially held the legal liability for the stolen funds. By signing those papers, you just handed them the final nail for your own coffin. Vanguard Equity is an asset of the trust, but the trust is now insolvent due to your embezzlement. You did not seize my empire, Donovan. You legally confessed to federal fraud and bankrupted yourself in a single stroke of a pen. I had my accountants look into Diana's estate years ago. There was $20 million in clean liquid capital sitting in a private trust. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table and steepling my fingers together. I kept my voice incredibly calm, dropping my tone to a lethal whisper that forced him to strain to hear the destruction of his entire life. You had your accountants look at outdated ledgers, I corrected smoothly. My mother was not just a shipping heir content to live off a fixed income while you paraded around town. Diana had ambitions, massive ambitions. She also had an incredibly high risk tolerance, something you never bothered to learn about the woman you married. Donovan stared at me, the color slowly draining from his face. Sylvia stopped dabbing her dry eyes. Her theatrical performance evaporated, replaced by a look of mounting horror. Richard Sterling, the high-priced lawyer, snatched the red folder from the table and began frantically flipping through the annotated pages. His eyes darted rapidly back and forth across the columns of numbers, his breathing growing shallow and fast. Before she died, I continued enunciating every single syllable with absolute precision. She leveraged her entire estate. Every single penny of that $20 million trust you have been salivating over for 2 decades. She used it as collateral to secure a massive $50 million loan from a Swiss bank. Donovan gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turned completely white. No, that is impossible. The bank would have notified me. I was her husband. You were legally separated, I reminded him, enjoying the raw panic radiating from his suddenly trembling hands. And she utilized a private offshore holding company to secure the funds. She wanted to fund a massive offshore venture, a deep-sea drilling operation in the South Pacific. It was a highly speculative, incredibly expensive, and entirely confidential international project. Sylvia let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her diamond necklace. $50 million? Exactly, I said, shifting my gaze to my stepmother. A $50 million venture that went completely under just months before she died. The drilling rig suffered catastrophic structural failures. The entire investment sank right to the bottom of the ocean. The $20 million trust is entirely empty. It has been empty for 20 years. Sterling slammed the red folder down onto the table. He ripped off his expensive glasses and dragged a shaking hand down his pale face. He looked at Donovan with an expression of pure fury and professional terror. You told me this was a clean trust execution. Sterling hissed, his voice cracking under the weight of his monumental malpractice. You explicitly swore to me that there were no hidden encumbrances. You demanded immediate execution. You waived discovery rights on the official record. You literally just signed the transfer documents assuming full control of the estate. You bypassed probate protections because you were too greedy to wait. Because it was always supposed to be free money for me, Donovan shouted, his panicked voice echoing loudly off the bare walls. She hid this from me. This is fraud. This is illegal. I will fight this in court. I will have this entire document thrown out. You cannot fight this. Richard Sterling snapped, backing away from the table as if Donovan had a contagious disease. Mediator Collins sat back in her chair, shaking her head in absolute disbelief. She looked at the signed documents and then at Donovan. Mr. Sterling is completely correct, the mediator stated clinically. By signing the irrevocable acceptance of the estate as the sole executor and primary beneficiary, you accept all assets and all attached debts. You demanded this execution. The court recognizes your signature as legally binding. Donovan immediately began to hyperventilate. He lunged forward across the table, desperately clawing at the signed papers, frantically trying to snatch them back. Sterling blocked his hand, pulling the documents out of his reach. The lawyer knew tampering with signed legal documents in front of a mediator would instantly result in his own disbarment. You cannot take it back, Donovan, I said, watching him hyperventilate. The Swiss bank has been holding that debt in a dormant file because the estate was locked in probate. The moment the court records your signature today, that file becomes active. Their automated systems will flag the estate transfer. They will attach the debt to your personal and corporate assets. Sylvia let out a piercing shriek. Our assets? Donovan, tell her she is lying. Tell her they cannot touch our money. What about the house? What about my accounts? I turned to Sylvia. The Swiss bank will not care about your house or your accounts. They care about recovering their $50 million. They will freeze every corporate account tied to Hayes Manufacturing. They will seize your personal properties, your luxury cars, your offshore accounts, and every diamond hanging around your neck. They are completely relentless. Donovan looked like he was going to vomit. He stared at the red folder, his empire crumbling into dust right before his eyes. He had walked into this room believing he was a corporate titan. He was walking out as a ruined man. I slowly and deliberately reached my own right hand across the polished mahogany table and tapped my index finger twice against the freshly signed acceptance paper. By signing that legally binding acceptance without an audit, you just assumed $50 million in international undischargeable corporate debt. You don't get $20 million. You owe $50 million. Immediately, Donovan's face turned the color of ash. A sound of pure panic tore from his throat as he lunged across the mahogany table. His suit jacket snagged on the wood, knocking over a crystal water pitcher that shattered loudly on the floor. He did not care. His eyes were wide with frantic desperation as he clawed at the execution papers sitting in front of Mediator Collins. He grabbed the top pages, his fingers scrabbling to tear the signed document to shreds. No! Donovan screamed, his voice cracking violently as he tried to rip the heavy parchment. I revoke it. I withdraw my claim. It is a trick. Richard Sterling tackled his client. The litigator shoved Donovan hard, physically wrestling the documents out of his grip. Sterling knew destroying notarized documents inside a mediation room was a path to immediate disbarment. The two men stumbled backward, slipping on the spilled water. Donovan pointed a shaking finger at me, his face twisting into a mask of hatred. You planned this, Donovan spat. You hid the debt to trap me. I am telling the court I was coerced. I did not know what I was signing. I demand a retraction right now. I did not flinch. I simply reached into my pocket and retrieved my smartphone. I swiped the screen, opened my voice memo application, and pressed play. I placed the phone flat on the table. The acoustics of the mediation room amplified the audio recording I had captured just 10 minutes prior. Donovan's own arrogant voice filled the space, playing back his exact damning words with crystal clarity. I demand immediate execution of this trust. I accept the estate in full. You overplayed your hand, Cassidy. You thought you could use your mother money to destroy me. Now you are going to walk out of this building with absolutely nothing. I tapped the screen to stop the playback. The silence that followed was suffocating. I looked directly into his panicked, bloodshot eyes. You demanded the execution. I stated clearly, my voice devoid of sympathy. You brought the documents. Your lawyer presented them. You signed them voluntarily, all while mocking me on the official record. There was no coercion. There was only your unrelenting greed. You were so desperate to steal my company that you blinded yourself to the reality of what you were taking. Mediator Collins stood up, her stern expression radiating absolute authority. She smoothed the wrinkled pages of the execution document, verifying that the signatures and seals remained intact. She looked down at Donovan with total professional disdain. Mr. Hayes, your behavior is completely unacceptable. Mediator, Collins warned firmly, leaving no room for debate. The audio recording corroborates the events that just transpired here. You cannot withdraw a claim because you suddenly regret the financial consequences of your own demands. This paperwork has already been notarized. Furthermore, my clerk scanned the digital copies into the electronic court record the exact second you completed your final signature. The transfer is legally binding, irreversible, and permanently filed with the federal judiciary system. Sterling sank into his chair, dropping his head into his hands. He had guided his client into a $50 million bear trap without conducting a preliminary audit of the offshore holding accounts. The malpractice lawsuits alone would ruin him. Sylvia finally realized the absolute gravity of the situation. Her tailored scarlet dress suddenly looked ridiculous. The heavy diamond necklaces draped across her collarbones no longer looked like trophies of wealth. They looked like assets waiting to be seized by international debt collectors. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. $50 million. Sylvia repeated, her voice shaking uncontrollably. We do not have $50 million. The liquid capital is tied up in the manufacturing firm. If the Swiss bank calls in the debt, they will liquidate everything. They will take the house. They will take the cars. They will freeze our accounts. They will take everything you ever bought with my mother money, I confirmed coldly. Every vacation, every piece of jewelry, every square inch of that mansion. It all belongs to the creditors now. You wanted Diana legacy so badly, Sylvia. Now you get to experience what it feels like to be completely consumed by it. Sylvia let out a piercing, desperate scream that reverberated through the room. She glared at me, her face contorted with a mixture of terror and furious defiance. We will not pay it! Sylvia shrieked, slamming her palms onto the mahogany table. You think you have beaten us, Cassidy, but you are wrong. We will just declare bankruptcy. We will file for Chapter 11 tomorrow morning. Let the bank try to collect. They can tie us up in court for a decade, but we will hide the assets. We will shelter the cash. You cannot squeeze blood from a stone. Donovan seized on her words, his panicked expression shifting back to a desperate, calculating sneer. She is right, he agreed, his chest heaving. We file for bankruptcy. The courts will protect the primary residence. We can shield the retirement accounts. We will restructure the debt and walk away clean. You went through all this trouble to trap me, Cassidy, but you forgot how the legal system protects corporate executives. I will survive this. I always survive. I sat back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. I watched them cling to their final desperate illusion of safety. They truly believed they could outsmart an international banking syndicate. They believed they could hide their stolen wealth behind the shield of federal bankruptcy protection. They had absolutely no idea how deep the hole they had just jumped into really was. A slow, sharp smile spread across my face. I looked at Donovan, then at Sylvia, letting my amusement radiate through the cold room. Oh, Sylvia, I said, my voice incredibly smooth, deliberate, and utterly merciless as I watched her. That brings me to my second and final surprise. The heavy oak doors of the downtown civil court mediation room swung open before Sylvia could even process my words. They hit the wall with a deafening crack that shattered the remaining tension in the room. Two agents wearing sharp, dark suits and windbreakers stepped across the threshold. Their expressions were entirely devoid of sympathy. They moved with military precision, bypassing the shocked mediator and walking directly toward the far side of the mahogany table. Both men raised their hands simultaneously, leather wallets flipping open to display gleaming gold shields. They belong to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically the Financial Crimes Division. Donovan stumbled backward, his chair violently scraping the hardwood floor. He tripped over its legs and nearly fell, throwing his hands up in a desperate defensive gesture. "What is this?" Donovan demanded, his voice cracking into a high pitch of absolute panic. "This is a civil mediation. You have absolutely no jurisdiction here. You need to leave immediately before I call the building security and have you thrown out." The lead agent did not even blink at the hollow threat. He stepped around the polished table, closing the distance between himself and my father in 3 long strides. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt, the metal clinking loudly in the silent room. "Donovan, you are under arrest for pension embezzlement, wire fraud, and money laundering." The lead agent stated, his voice carrying the immovable weight of federal authority. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." Sylvia let out a sound that was half gasp, half choke. She pressed her back against the wood paneling of the wall, shrinking away from her husband, as if his sudden criminal status were contagious. Richard Sterling, ever the ruthless opportunist, practically vaulted out of his seat. He grabbed his sleek briefcase and sprinted to the far corner of the room, physically distancing himself from Donovan. He raised his hands in surrender, silently communicating to the federal agents that he wanted absolutely no part in whatever collateral damage was about to rain down. "You cannot do this," Donovan stammered, his eyes darting wildly between the agents, his lawyer, and me. "I am a respected corporate executive. I own Hayes Manufacturing. My lawyers will have your badges for this outrage. I am a pillar of this community." "You do not own anything anymore," I interjected, my voice cutting through his pathetic bluster. I remained seated, perfectly composed, watching his entire existence burn to the ground. "When you drained the employee pension fund to finance Sylvia's lavish lifestyle, you crossed state lines with the wired funds. That made it a federal offense. The FBI has been building this case for 6 months. They just needed the final undeniable proof of who controlled the corrupted accounts. They needed a signature binding the thief to the stolen offshore assets." I gestured gracefully toward the execution papers sitting in front of Mediator Collins. "You just gave them that signature," I explained, savoring the absolute destruction on his face. "You voluntarily signed the legal transfer binding yourself as the sole executor. You claim the trust, and by doing so you claim the $50 million debt and the $14 million in stolen federal pension funds. You gift-wrapped your own federal indictment and handed it directly to the Justice Department. You handed them the exact documentation required to put you in a federal penitentiary for the next 2 decades. The second agent stepped forward, grabbing Donovan by the bicep and spinning him around. Donovan struggled, his face turning a mottled, furious purple, but he was completely powerless against the trained agent. The cold steel of the handcuff snapped shut around his wrists, locking his hands behind his back. The sharp click echoed with finality. I watched him breathe heavily, his chest heaving as the reality of his future set in. He was not going back to his suburban mansion. He was not returning to his corner office. He was going to a federal holding cell, stripped of his wealth, his power, and his freedom. Every asset he had stolen from me, my mother and his employees, was subject to federal seizure and liquidation. Suddenly, a sharp commotion erupted in the hallway. High heels rapidly clicked against the marble tiles. The agents turned toward the doorway just as Madison pushed her way into the mediation room. She had been waiting in the lobby, eager to celebrate what she assumed would be my total financial ruin. Instead, she walked into a nightmare. Madison stopped dead in her tracks, her designer purse slipping from her shoulder and hitting the floor. She stared at her father, who was pinned against the wall in handcuffs by a federal agent. She looked at Sylvia, who was sobbing uncontrollably in the corner. Finally, she looked at the red financial ledger resting on the center of the mahogany table. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She raised her hand, her perfectly manicured finger pointing directly across the room at me. "She set us up," Madison shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the heavy wooden doors. Her eyes were wide with a frantic, desperate anger. "She faked the accounting. Cassidy orchestrated all of this to steal the company. She framed him because she knew she could never win fairly. Arrest her. She is the one you want. She is a liar and a thief. The federal agents ignored her outburst completely. They continued reciting Donovan, his Miranda rights, their voices steady and professional over the sound of her screaming. Mediator Collins calmly gathered her files, stepping away from the chaos. I placed my hands flat on the table and pushed myself up from my leather chair. I smoothed the lapels of my blazer. I stood up, walking slowly around the table toward my terrified sister. I walked slowly around the mahogany table, my heels clicking a steady beat against the hardwood floor. The sound echoed in the sudden quiet of the mediation room, cutting through the panicked breathing of the people who had spent my life trying to destroy me. Madison pressed her back against the heavy oak doors, her face drained of color. The arrogant sneer she had worn moments ago had vanished, replaced by the wide-eyed terror of a spoiled child realizing her protective bubble had just violently popped. "You think I faked the accounting?" I said, my voice eerily calm, as I stopped a few feet away from her. I looked her up and down, taking in her designer dress and the expensive leather handbag lying abandoned on the floor. Federal agents do not conduct raids based on forged ledgers, Madison. They operate on absolute, irrefutable proof. They operate on verifiable bank transfers, offshore account routing numbers, and documented wire fraud. The FBI has been tracking every single transaction your father made for months. They know exactly where the money went. Madison shook her head in frantic denial, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face. She looked toward our father for reassurance, but Donovan was currently pinned against the wood paneling, his hands locked in federal restraints. "He is a respected businessman," Madison cried out, though her voice lacked any real conviction. "He built Hayes Manufacturing from the ground up. He would never steal from his own employees. You are lying. You arranged this just to ruin us because you are jealous." "Jealous," I repeated, allowing a sharp, humorless laugh to escape my lips. I gestured toward Donovan, who was sweating profusely under the stern gaze of the two federal agents. "Look at him, Madison. Look at the man who funded your entire life. Do you honestly believe his failing company paid for your sports cars, your European vacations, and your high-rise apartment? Hayes Manufacturing has been hemorrhaging capital for the last 5 years. He has not turned a legitimate profit since I left for college. Your entire existence is funded by the stolen retirement savings of factory workers who gave decades of their lives to this family. You are wearing stolen money." Madison flinched as if I had physically struck her. She looked down at her expensive clothes, her hands trembling as the horrifying reality of her situation finally breached her wall of denial. Sylvia let out a loud, pathetic sob from the corner, sinking into one of the leather chairs. The diamonds around Sylvia's neck clanked together, a sound that no longer represented elite status, but rather undeniable physical evidence of federal financial crimes. I turned my attention away from my sister and focused on the man who caused this destruction. Donovan was hyperventilating. His chest heaved erratically, and his face had turned the color of wet ash. The corporate titan who had confidently strolled into this mediation room was completely gone, replaced by a terrified criminal realizing the walls had closed in. I stepped away from Madison and closed the distance between myself and my father. The federal agents watched me carefully but did not intervene. They understood that I was not a threat to their prisoner. I was the architect of his capture. I looked down at Donovan, watching the sweat bead on his forehead. I did not fake anything I said, making sure my voice carried clearly to every corner of the room. Every document in that red folder is entirely authentic. Every transaction is real. Donovan shook his head frantically, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape route that did not exist. "I do not understand," he gasped, his voice tight and wheezing. The offshore accounts were completely anonymous. The transfers were heavily encrypted through international privacy channels. There is absolutely no way you or the authorities could have traced those specific funds back to me. It is impossible. I tilted my head, studying him with cold, clinical precision. "Do you remember the private offshore holding company that kept giving your failing business miracle loans for the last 4 years?" I asked smoothly. the mysterious venture capital firm that continuously bailed you out every single time Hayes Manufacturing was about to default on its payroll obligations, the exact same firm that provided the influx of cash you happily used to buy Sylvia those diamonds and Madison those luxury cars. Donovan stopped struggling against the agents, his bloodshot eyes locked onto mine, a new, horrifying realization beginning to dawn in his expression. I leaned in close, ensuring he heard every single word I was about to deliver. That holding company is a direct, wholly owned subsidiary of Vanguard Equity, I stated, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. I gave you the rope, Dad. I funded your lavish lifestyle with my own money specifically to create a flawless, mathematically trackable paper trail of your wire fraud and embezzlement. You took my loans to fund your pathetic illusion of wealth. When the balloon payments came due, and you inevitably did not have the cash, you panicked. You stole millions directly from your employees' pension fund to pay back your generous international creditor. You stole from your own loyal workers just to pay me back. The profound silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Donovan's ragged, shallow breathing. The federal agents remained perfectly still, processing the magnitude of the trap I had carefully laid. I had not just caught him stealing. I had financed the desperation that drove him to commit the crime, forcing him to leave an undeniable digital fingerprint on every stolen dollar. Donovan's knees buckled. He sagged against the wood paneling, physically crushed by the weight of his own monumental stupidity. He clutched his chest with his restrained hands, his face contorting in agony. The arrogant patriarch realized in one devastating moment that he had literally been dancing in the palm of my hand for half a decade. I took a slow, deliberate step toward Madison. Her back remained pressed against the heavy oak doors, her chest heaving as the reality of my words settled over the room like a suffocating shroud. She looked at our father, who was still gasping for air against the wood paneling, completely broken by the revelation of the Vanguard equity trap. The federal agents maintained their iron grip on him, their expressions carved from stone. Madison could not find salvation in Donovan anymore. His empire was dead, and he was going to prison. She looked at Sylvia, who was currently curled into a pathetic sobbing ball in the corner, clutching her stolen diamonds, as if they could somehow shield her from a federal indictment. There was no help there either. Madison let out a sharp, ragged gasp. Her eyes darted wildly toward the hallway, desperate for a lifeline. She found one, stepping right through the doorway. Kendrick walked into the mediation room. He moved with a calm, terrifying precision, slipping past the federal agents in his immaculate charcoal suit. His posture was rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles fluttered beneath his skin. He carried a thick leather briefcase in his right hand. Madison instantly lunged toward him. She grabbed the lapels of his suit jacket, her manicured nails digging into the expensive fabric. Her voice was shrill, bordering on absolute hysteria. Kendrick Madison screamed, shaking him frantically. "You are an auditor. You know the law. Get us out of this. Tell them it is a huge mistake. Tell them the holding company transfers were perfectly legal." Kendrick did not embrace her. He looked at Madison with eyes as cold as ice. He stared down at the woman he had married. His gaze was entirely devoid of warmth, stripped of the affection she had always manipulated. He looked at her as if she were a dangerous liability. Slowly, deliberately, Kendrick reached up and peeled Madison's frantic hands off his suit jacket. He shoved her wrists away with a firm, disgusted motion that sent her stumbling backward. Madison hit the edge of the mahogany table, her mouth falling open in shock. "Mistake?" Kendrick repeated, his voice dangerously low, echoing the chilling frequency of a judge delivering a death sentence. "There is no mistake here, Madison. The only mistake I ever made was believing the pathetic lies you and your father sold me." He placed his leather briefcase flat on the polished table right next to the shattered crystal pitcher and the federal execution documents Donovan had so arrogantly signed. The snap of the brass locks echoed loudly. Kendrick opened the case and reached inside. He pulled out two separate documents. He held up the first one, a massive stack of bound audit reports flagged with red tabs and stamped with federal routing numbers. He dropped it directly in front of her. It hit the wood with a resounding thud. I did not just review the corporate ledgers, Kendrick stated, his eyes locked onto her terrified face. I conducted a comprehensive independent forensic audit of Hayes Manufacturing and every single one of your personal accounts. I traced every wire transfer, every miracle loan, and every shell company transaction straight back to the Cayman Islands. Madison stared at the thick stack of papers, her breath hitching. Her hands began to tremble violently. You audited my accounts, she whispered, the panic returning in full force. Why would you ever do that? We are legally married. Because I refuse to be complicit in a federal crime. Kendrick fired back, his voice rising with righteous fury. I am a licensed fiduciary. When I noticed the glaring irregularities in your father's payroll tax filings, I dug deeper. And when I kept digging, I found the absolute rot at the center of your entire lifestyle. He tapped a rigid finger against the top of the audit report. I handed the evidence to the FBI myself, Madison. Your boutique was built on the stolen retirement funds of working-class people. I have been cooperating with their financial crimes division for the past 3 months. I gave them the routing numbers. I gave them the encrypted communication logs. I gave them the definitive proof that your high-end fashion boutique was not a successful independent business. It was a massive money laundering front. Madison let out a strangled cry. She covered her mouth with both hands, shaking her head in violent denial. No, that is a lie. My boutique is legitimate. I built that brand from the ground up. Dad gave me a startup loan. It was clean money. Nothing your father touches is clean, Kendrick shouted finally, letting his tightly coiled anger snap. He stole $14 million from the employee pension fund, and he funneled $4 million of it directly into your boutique to wash the cash. You knew exactly where it came from. I found the emails between you and Sylvia discussing how to hide the assets from the IRS. You are just as guilty as he is, Sylvia wailed louder from the corner, burying her face in her hands. Donovan groaned, sagging further against the wall, as the federal agent secured his restraints, realizing his own son-in-law had driven the final nail into his coffin. I watched Madison completely shatter. The golden child, the perfect socialite, the woman who had spent her entire life looking down on everyone else, was suddenly facing the total annihilation of her identity. Kendrick was not finished. He reached back into his leather briefcase. His movements were clinical, completely detached from the emotional wreckage surrounding him. He retrieved a single slim manila folder. He held it up, making sure Madison saw the legal seal stamped on the front cover. He dropped the second document right on top of the damning audit reports. Those are divorce papers, Kendrick says firmly. I am taking full custody of our finances, and you are getting absolutely nothing. I don't stay married to parasites. Madison stared at the manila envelope as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. Her perfectly glossed lips parted in a silent scream of disbelief. She reached out her trembling fingers, hovering over the divorce papers, unable to actually make contact with the reality of her ruined marriage. Kendrick did not offer a single ounce of comfort. He simply turned his back on her, adjusted his pristine suit jacket, and walked toward the heavy oak doors. He did not look back. He did not hesitate. He abandoned her to the exact destruction she had joyously wished upon me. The loud click of the door latch echoing behind Kendrick acted like a physical blow to Sylvia. Her legs buckled entirely. The remaining shred of her manufactured dignity evaporated into thin air. Sylvia collapsed onto the hardwood floor. The sound of her knees hitting the polished wood was sharp and desperate. She scrambled forward, crawling across the ground with zero regard for her expensive scarlet dress. She reached my position and lunged forward. Sylvia dropped to her knees, sobbing hysterically. Tears ruined her flawless makeup, streaking black mascara down her pale cheeks. She grabbed the hem of my skirt, her knuckles white with absolute desperation. She clung to the fabric like a drowning woman clinging to a life raft. "Please, Cassidy!" Sylvia shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the mediation room. "We are your family. You cannot let them take your father away. I will give back the jewelry. I will give you the house. I will give you everything. Just drop the debt. Call off the bank." I looked down at the woman who had happily spent my mother's money, who had mocked my existence, who had celebrated my pain. Her tear-stained face held absolutely no remorse for her actions. She was only sorry that she had finally been caught. I stepped back smoothly, pulling my skirt from Sylvia's frantic grasp. I looked down with zero pity. The coldness in my chest was absolute. "You do not get to invoke the word family when you are looking down the barrel of a gun," I stated, my voice echoing with lethal precision. "You gave up that right at gate 24. Sylvia wailed, curling into a pathetic ball on the floor. She wrapped her arms around her head, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of her absolute destitution washed over her. She had nothing left to bargain with. The diamonds she wore were stolen property. The mansion she lived in was slated for federal seizure. The bank accounts she relied on were frozen solid by federal mandate. She was a beggar in a designer gown. Madison slid down the wall until she hit the floor next to her mother. The golden child was reduced to a hyperventilating mess. She hugged her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth as she stared blankly at the divorce papers resting on the mahogany table. Her boutique, her marriage, her reputation, and her financial security had all been eradicated in the span of 10 minutes. She was no longer a wealthy socialite. She was the unindicted accomplice to a massive federal fraud operation. Richard Sterling remained pinned against the far corner of the room. The high-priced litigator looked physically ill. His expensive briefcase hung limply from his grasp. He was already calculating the catastrophic impact this would have on his legal career. Assisting a client in signing documents that transferred stolen federal pension funds was a career-ending disaster. He would be facing ethical review boards, disbarment hearings, and potentially his own federal indictment for facilitating the transaction. He slowly edged toward the door, eager to escape the radioactive fallout radiating from the Hayes family. Mediator Collins stood silently by the window. She watched the scene unfold with total professional detachment. The mediation was officially over. There was nothing left to mediate. The assets were frozen, the debts were activated, and the criminal charges were actively being processed. She carefully placed the signed, legally binding execution documents into a secure envelope. Those pages were now federal evidence. I stood in the center of the wreckage, my posture straight and my breathing steady. 5 years ago, I had sat alone in an international airport clutching $200, abandoned by the people currently sobbing on the floor. I had spent half a decade meticulously architecting their demise. Every investment, every offshore loan, every perfectly timed email had led to this exact moment. I had not destroyed them. I had simply handed them the shovel and watched them dig their own graves. The lead FBI agent firmly grabbed Donovan by his handcuffed arms. He hauled the ruined executive away from the wood-paneled wall. Donovan stumbled, his expensive leather shoes scraping against the floorboards. He looked older, broken, and entirely devoid of the power he had wielded so ruthlessly. "Let us go," the agent ordered sharply. "You have a long day of processing ahead of you." The second agent moved to his other side, securing a tight grip on Donovan. They began marching him toward the heavy oak doors. Donovan dragged his feet, turning his head back toward the room. He looked at Sylvia weeping on the floor. He looked at Madison rocking against the wall. Finally, his bloodshot eyes locked onto mine. The sheer magnitude of his hatred burned brightly, a futile attempt to inflict pain on a woman completely immune to his venom. "You are a stain on this family," Donovan yelled, his voice cracking with panicked fury as the agents hauled him forward. "You hear me? A stain." I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I stood perfectly still, delivering the ultimate verbal kill shot with absolute chilling clarity. "You do not have a family to have a stain on anymore, Donovan." The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind him. I stood alone in the absolute silence of the room, totally victorious at last. My long debt was finally paid. 6 months passed with the brutal, unforgiving efficiency of a perfectly executed corporate takeover. The flickering, static-filled screen of a pawnshop television cast a sickly blue glow across the linoleum floor of a cramped living room. A local news anchor stared from the display, delivering the final chapter of a spectacular corporate downfall. Former Chief Executive Officer Donovan Hayes was sentenced today to 8 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole, the anchor announced smoothly. Hayes was convicted of pension embezzlement, wire fraud, and severe financial mismanagement. The judge cited the absolute devastation Hayes inflicted upon working-class employees when handing down the maximum sentence. Federal authorities entirely liquidated his personal assets to pay full restitution to the defrauded pension fund. The news broadcast echoed off the peeling wallpaper of a grimy, rundown apartment complex located on the furthest industrial outskirts of the city. This neighborhood was completely forgotten by wealth and privilege. The air smelled of diesel exhaust, damp concrete, and rotting garbage. There were no manicured lawns, no valet parking, and no boardrooms. A rusted van sputtered into the cracked asphalt parking lot. The engine whined and coughed before dying with a violent shudder. The side of the van bore the faded logo of a commercial cleaning service. The passenger door groaned loudly as it was forced open. Sylvia stepped onto the oil-stained pavement. She looked completely unrecognizable. The woman who once draped herself in stolen diamonds was entirely gone. Sylvia wore a shapeless, faded gray polyester uniform. Her hands were now red, heavily calloused, and blistering from months of scrubbing industrial chemical toilets. Her hair was pulled back into a severe knot, exposing a face lined with exhaustion and inescapable stress. Madison stumbled out from the driver's side. She dragged her feet. Her posture slumped under the weight of her new reality. The glamorous socialite who sneered at anyone deemed beneath her class now wore the exact same cheap, ill-fitting gray uniform. Expensive designer bags had been permanently replaced by heavy garbage bags. "Grab the handles tight," Sylvia instructed, her voice devoid of its former haughty musicality. "If you drag the plastic on the concrete again and tear the bottom, the shift manager will dock our pay. We cannot afford another penalty this week." Madison did not argue. She simply nodded, her eyes dull and hollow. She reached into the back of the van and hauled out a massive leaking trash bag. She hoisted it onto her hip, wincing as foul-smelling liquid seeped through her uniform and stained her thigh. This was their daily existence. They worked brutal shifts, cleaning the same corporate offices they used to visit for cocktail parties. They scrubbed baseboards and mopped floors for minimum wage. The true punishment was the relentless financial trap they willingly signed up for in mediation. Because Donovan transferred the estate to them right before his arrest, federal bankruptcy courts dismantled their legal defense. The $50 million debt attached to the estate was ruled completely undischargeable. Every time Sylvia and Madison received their cleaning paychecks, the federal garnishment mandates immediately kicked in. The bank seized 70% of their minimum wage earnings to chip away at the debt. They were trapped in a perpetual cycle of poverty, working to the bone just to afford rent on a rotting apartment that barely had running water. Madison dropped her trash bag by the overflowing communal dumpster. She leaned against the rusted metal bin, gasping for breath. The harsh wind whipped loose hair across her face, sticking to the sweat on her cheeks. She looked down at her ruined hands, the nails chipped and bleeding. Working until the day she died to pay off a fraction of a debt she could never escape was finally breaking her mind. She needed a way out. She needed someone to rescue her from the slum. With trembling fingers, Madison reached into the pocket of her gray uniform. She pulled out a cheap prepaid smartphone. The glass screen was heavily spiderwebbed with cracks, making it difficult to read. She swiped her thumb across the broken glass, ignoring the sharp edges. She navigated to her contacts list. She had a few numbers left. Every single one of her wealthy socialite friends had blocked her the second the FBI raided the boutique. The country club acquaintances had instantly vanished. She scrolled down until she found the name she was looking for. Kendrick. He was a highly successful auditor. He had a beautiful downtown condo. He had money. He had influence. Surely after 6 months his anger had cooled. Surely he would remember the good times they shared before the collapse. If she just apologized, if she begged for a second chance, maybe he would let her move back in. She just needed a lifeline. Madison pressed the call button and held the cracked plastic to her ear. She held her breath, waiting for the familiar ringtone. Instead of a ring, a brief burst of static filled the speaker. Then a sterile, automated operator voice delivered a perfectly unfeeling mechanical response. "The number you have dialed has been disconnected or is no longer in service." Madison stood frozen. The phone slipped from her grasp, clattering onto the filthy pavement. The finality of the automated message shattered the last sliver of hope she possessed. Kendrick was entirely gone. He had changed his number. He had erased her from his life completely and permanently. There was no rescue coming. There was no hidden escape hatch. This rotting alleyway was her permanent home. Madison sank to her knees on the oil-stained concrete. She buried her face in her hands and burst into miserable, agonizing tears. She wept for her lost wealth, destroyed status, and her inescapable future. Sylvia watched her daughter break, but she did not move to comfort her. Sylvia just picked up another trash bag, her face entirely blank, leaving Madison to cry alone and completely ignored in the slum. The morning sun broke across the Chicago skyline, casting brilliant slashes of gold and amber against the towering glass facades of the city. I stood still in the center of my corner office, on the 50th floor of the Vanguard Equity Building. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the empire I had conquered. Below me, the city moved with a frantic, desperate energy, a chaotic swarm of ambition and survival. Up here, however, the air was still silent and absolute. I pressed my palm against the cool, thick glass, feeling the subtle vibration of the wind high above the streets. The sensation grounded me. I wore a tailored, immaculate white suit today. The crisp, structured lines of the fabric were a deliberate choice. White represented a clean slate, a blank canvas, a total erasure of the mud and grime my so-called family had spent their entire lives trying to force upon me. It was the armor of a woman who had walked through the fire and emerged entirely untouched by the flames. My posture was rigid but relaxed, radiating a profound, unshakable serenity. The relentless, gnawing anxiety that had defined my early 20s was completely gone. The desperate need to prove my worth to people fundamentally incapable of recognizing it had evaporated the moment those federal agents dragged Donovan out of the mediation room. I took a deep, steadying breath, inhaling the faint scent of expensive leather and polished mahogany that defined my sanctuary. The ghosts of the past no longer haunted me. I had buried them under a mountain of undeniable, verified financial success. The heavy, frosted glass door to my office slid open with a soft, expensive whisper of sound. I did not turn around immediately. I recognized the confident, measured cadence of the footsteps crossing the plush carpeting. Kendrick walked into the room, bringing with him the rich, roasted aroma of dark artisan coffee. He moved with a completely different energy now. The tense, suffocatingly stressed auditor who had been trapped in Madison's web of deceit was dead and buried. The man approaching my desk was the newly minted chief financial officer of Vanguard Equity. He wore a sharp, bespoke navy blue suit that perfectly matched the newfound authority he carried. He looked rested, focused, and entirely in his element. The heavy burdens of his past marriage had been legally and financially severed, allowing his natural brilliance to finally take center stage. He set a steaming porcelain cup down on the edge of my massive obsidian desk. The ceramic clicked softly against the polished stone. He took his place beside me at the window, looking out over the sprawling metropolis with a shared sense of profound victory. We stood shoulder to shoulder, two architects of our own salvation, bound by a mutual respect, forged in the crucible of taking down the Hayes Empire. The silence between us was comfortable, devoid of the toxic, manipulative tension that had characterized every interaction involving my family. Kendrick adjusted his cuffs, his eyes scanning the horizon before he finally turned his attention to the business at hand. "The foreclosure on Donovan's estate went through this morning," Kendrick stated, his voice, a smooth, professional baritone. He handed me a sleek, black digital tablet, his finger tapping the screen to highlight the final legal confirmation. "The bank handed over the physical deed to us less than an hour ago. The transfer of ownership is totally complete, irrevocable, and permanently recorded in the county registry." He crossed his arms over his chest, leaning slightly against the window frame. The primary mortgage, the secondary leverage loans, and the massive federal tax liens were completely wiped out in the asset seizure. Vanguard Equity now holds the exclusive unencumbered title to the entire property. The grounds, the main house, the guest quarters, all of it. Kendrick paused, allowing the sheer magnitude of the victory to settle over the room. The structural dismantling of Donovan's legacy was now a matter of public record. His illusion of generational wealth had been reduced to a simple digital signature on a corporate asset ledger. Kendrick looked at me, a subtle calculating gleam in his sharp eyes. He knew exactly what this moment meant. He understood the poetic justice of Vanguard Equity, possessing the very soil where I had been endlessly humiliated and treated like a second-class citizen. So Kendrick asked, lowering his voice into a quiet, serious register. The asset is entirely yours to command. The zoning permits are wide open, and the structural value of the land itself is astronomical. What exactly do you want to do with the mansion? I turned away from the glass and picked up the porcelain cup Kendrick had brought me. I brought it to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark, bitter coffee. The heat bloomed pleasantly in my chest. I looked back out at the magnificent city skyline, at the towering structures of steel and light that I had conquered through my own relentless, brilliant strategy and unyielding patience. A genuine smile broke across my face. I was completely at peace standing at the absolute pinnacle of the mountain I had climbed alone. Tear it to the ground, I commanded, my voice ringing with absolute lethal certainty. Bulldoze every last brick. Shatter the marble floors, rip out the chandeliers, and pulverize the foundation until there is absolutely nothing left but dirt. We are going to build a tuition-free STEM academy for underprivileged girls on that exact lot. Kendrick widened his eyes slightly before a slow, profoundly satisfied smile spread across his face. He nodded his head in total agreement, thoroughly understanding the perfect symmetry of the decision. It is time to clear out the trash and build something that actually matters, I finalized. I turned back to the window, watching the city move below me. I was no longer a victim. I was the ultimate architect of my own magnificent destiny.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river. Years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter. In every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't makes me whole. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low, but the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every